If you ever used Java or a framework based on Java like Spring to build a backend service or an API, you probably use something like Tomcat. And Tomcat is a Java servlet container, right? And what I mean by a Java servlet container, it means that it receives requests from a client. It receives HTTP requests, dynamically compile a Java class to handle the request. And this Java class is the servlet, right? So whenever Tomcat receives an HTTP request, it compile a Java class, which is the servlet, to handle the request. And Tomcat, as a web server, listens for requests on a certain port, 8080 by default. So you can think of Tomcat basically like a web server, right? Because, as I said, it listens to HTTP requests on a port, plus a servlet container, because, as I said, when Tomcat receives a HTTP request, it compiles a Java class to handle the request. And this Java class is what we call a servlet. And an example of servlet is like this. So if I go to my editor, we can have this class. So as I said, it's just a simple class. It extends HTTP servlet from the JavaX HTTP package. And we can override a lot of methods. Like we can override init method, and we can override doGet to manage, for example, the get request from this request. And we can obviously override a lot of others methods like doHead, doPost for post request, put for put request, delete for delete request, and same thing. So this is basically a servlet. It's just a simple Java class that we use to handle an HTTP request, and we can tell the URL pattern of the request either by annotation or by XML configuration. So we just add some metadata either by annotation or XML to tell Tomcat that we want to use this servlet to handle this URL pattern, this request example, for example, right? So now let's go and see the steps that it's used in Tomcat. So the first thing first is Tomcat receives an HTTP request. So this is the first thing, because as I said, Tomcat listens on a port and waits for HTTP request. So the first thing is Tomcat receives an HTTP request and then maps the request to the appropriate servlet. And Tomcat maps the request to appropriate servlet by either by configuration, basically, either by annotation or by XML configuration. And then Tomcat checks to see if that servlet class has been loaded. If not, Tomcat compiles the servlet into Java bytecode, which is executable by the JVM, and create an instance. So for example, let's say I made a request to example, right, to this URL. Then what does Tomcat see? It checks if this class is created, right, if it's compiled. If it's not compiled, so let's say it's the first time I ever received a request on this pattern, then Tomcat create an instance of this class in the Tomcat context, right? If it's already created, then it just uses the instance that we already have. And when we want to create a new instance, Tomcat initializes the servlet by calling its init method. So this is the method that used by Tomcat to initialize our servlet. So we can write some code right here if you want. That's some custom code that we want to be executed when we first initialize our servlet, right? And then Tomcat can call the servlet service method to process the request. So if we receive a get request, for example, we can manage the request here. For example, I want to basically use this object because the doGet have a HTTP request and a response, right? So we can, for example, use get some information from the request, right? So we can get cookies, we can get a header, we can get everything we want, the request URL, etc. Right? So we can handle our HTTP request inside of this method. And if we want to handle a post request, as I showed you earlier, we can override the doPost, for example, to handle our post request for this pattern, right? And that's it. That's pretty much the process, how Tomcat works to process the HTTP request that it receives. Now let's see in the case of Spring Boot, right? So right here I have a Spring Boot application, right? And usually with Spring Boot we do not have to explicitly use a Tomcat server, and the reason why is because Spring Boot has in it what we call an embedded server. So it has an embedded Tomcat server, so we don't have to explicitly put our var in a Tomcat server, but we will do it anyway for the sake of example. But the first thing I'll do is just extend the Spring Boot servlet initializer, right? And I have this get mapping right here to just test. And the thing we need to do is to change the packaging, right? So I go to my POM XML, right? And I need to do to the packaging. And the packaging I did here is var. And this is the type of packaging that we want to use in our Tomcat server, right? And the second thing we need to do is to have Tomcat in our machine, right? I already have Tomcat in my machine. If you don't have it, you can just go and download it online. Okay, so you go to Tomcat, so I have it here, and you go to web apps. So right here is where we put our application, where we put the var, our package of the application. So now we need to create the package, and we do that by using Maven. And another thing before, we need to have this dependency, this Spring Boot starter Tomcat, this Spring Boot dependency. So how do we create our package? It's pretty simple. We can use Maven. So the first thing I need to do is to clean. I want to clean everything. So this is Maven clean if you want to write it in the console. And then we will use Maven package to create our package. There we go. So the package, Maven package, has ended, and we can find our package in target. So we go to target and we find it right here. So this is the demo snapshot.war, because we specified in POM XML that we want the packaging to be war file. So what we do is just simply copy this war file, right? We copy it and we go to our web apps directory inside of Apache Tomcat, and we just put it right here. So let me pass the war. There we go. So we have it right here, and then I open my console and I go to bin. So it's here, bin, and here we want to execute Catalina, I don't know how to pronounce it, .bat. This is for Windows, and if you are using Mac OS or Linux, you can execute catalina.sh. Right? So let's do it. And we execute run. We want to run our web app. So let's do it. And we'll wait. Let's wait. Okay, so my server now is run. So we have our server is run. So to go to access our application, we need to go to localhost 8080, as I said. And let me wait. There we go. So this is the default Tomcat page, home page, right? But if I want to go to my project that I created, I need to go to a specific pattern, and the specific pattern is my var name. So this is demo 001 snapshot. So let me write it, demo 001 snapshot, and let me go to the hello mapping that I created. So hello, there we go. So I accessed my application that I deployed on Tomcat. So if I go to web apps, right, we can find that we have this folder created, and I can access it by writing demo, the name of the folder, and then I can write the different mapping that I created for my application. That's pretty much it for Tomcat if you want to do it manually. And if you are wondering why we need Tomcat for Spring or Spring Boot, because in Spring and Spring Boot we don't really use servlet, right? We just use controller. And the answer to that is because Spring is built on servlet, right? So we don't use it explicitly, but Spring Boot and Spring were built on servlet. So when you run a Spring application, it needs a Java servlet container. So for it to run and for it to work, it needs a Java servlet container like Tomcat. There is a lot of other Java servlet container, but the most common used one, because it's open source, is Tomcat. And also in Spring, we have what we call a dispatcher servlet, which is the first front controller, and it's a servlet. Dispatcher servlet is a servlet, so it needs a Java servlet container like Tomcat. So as I said, whenever we use a Java backend service, we definitely need a Java servlet container. That's pretty much it. Thank you.